In this video, we're going to take a look at the Hellenistic age. So really the period of time that begins kind of at the death of Alexander the Great, and as his empire is then divided amongst his generals, particularly two important generals, and the changes that begin to take place in different parts of the East that Alexander the Great had acquired. So we'll begin here, first of all, by noticing that one of the things that happens with Alexander's conquest in the East, this begins to open up new doors for expansions and governing for Macedonians and Greeks. Now, particularly in the areas that Alexander had won from the Persians, areas of Babylon and even farther east, is Alexander was quite sensitive enough to know that he needed um, former Persian officials to become satraps or rulers over these areas. The Many of the Macedonians and the Greeks, didn't know the language of the areas and weren't really interested in learning the language that much. And so Alexander, while he was still alive, then just made different Persians the satraps of these areas. But after Alexander the Great's death, and after there is some time for Greeks to have authority in the area, things begin to change where those who have kind of a Greek ancestry or Greek heritage are oftentimes given more prominence or given more opportunities. So a substantial number of Greeks begin to immigrate to make their fortunes in conquered territories. So just like during the time when Athens was becoming wealthy and it was sending out its people to colonize different areas, or people sought opportunities to colonize in different areas. Now, with these territories that are going to be run and administered and protected by Greeks, um, many are beginning to move now into these areas to find new fortunes. Greekness, then, either by birth or by education, gave people a certain kind of privilege and status. So, a person who is Greek but living in the East uh, are people who are seen to have greater opportunities that are afforded to them. They're recognized with a greater status. And so it becomes desirable amongst people in the East to gain a Greek education. After his death in 323 BC, his generals did battle for territories. But most significantly, as far as the East is concerned, and particularly because our course is focused on the rise of early Christianity, so we're interested here in the Jesus movement and the early apostles in Palestine, and then as Paul the apostle and begins to spread the message of the gospel. We're really interested primarily in two of these generals, and that is Ptolemy the First, who gains control or authority over Egypt, and Seleucus the First, who basically gets control of what we might call today Syria, and then as well over Babylon. So there's a very complicated history about how Seleucus gained power over Syria and uh, Babylon. But we'll leave it right now, as these are the two figures that have the most significance. Their rule have the most significance in the development of Judaism in the time prior to Christ. So a key component of Hellenism is mixing the syncretism of the religions of conquered peoples with that of the Greeks. So, you might have an example of the Egyptian religion of Isis being kind of adopted by the Greeks. So, Greeks, unlike the Persian, now the Persians would taunt the people that they conquered and their gods. They would ridicule them. They would, destroy their figures of worship, their idols. But the Greeks saw that these should be respected. And that's one of the things that Alexander the Great oftentimes did when he went into areas. He acknowledged the gods of the other people. He did not, try to humiliate them and their gods. Their gods didn't save them from Alexander conquering them. And he would oftentimes sacrifice, or he would make acknowledgments of other people's gods. And so that certainly did win some favors or respect as Alexander had moved throughout the East. So, but this becomes a particularly important part of Hellenism, that everyone can have their own gods, and if everyone will treat with respect each other's gods, then the communities, the areas can live at peace. So let's look at here about Jews under Ptolemies very quickly, because this is going to be really important for the understanding of the development of the Bible, in particular with Greek influence. So some Jews did resist Ptolemy's invasion into Jerusalem, which occurred on the Sabbath. And because they did, they were subsequently deported to Egypt and were sold into slavery. So a number of Jews are taken out of Jerusalem and are deported here to Egypt and are living in Egypt and, becoming a part of Egyptian culture. Ptolemy II, who lived from 284 to 246 BCE, then freed Jewish slaves, but many Jews remained where they had been deported to. So in other words, this had become home. This is what they knew. So they didn't go back to Jerusalem. And so we have a number of Jews who are living in Egypt. So Jewish populations grew more rapidly, partly due to Jewish rejection of the common practice of infanticide. So it was common amongst the Greeks and other people that, if you have a child, if you really wanted a boy and you had a girl, you would just abandon the girl out in the woods or out in a dump heap or somewhere and just let that child die. And so that was a common practice. If your child had some kind of deformity about it, you just leave it to die. So, but Jews did not practice infanticide, and so because of that, their numbers would grow more. So Judea, the area just around Jerusalem, including Jerusalem, stayed submissive to Ptolemaic rule, despite the fact that the Ptolemies heavily taxed, and they enforced their taxes through what they called local tax collectors. So, of course, that becomes kind of important for us as we then begin to see tax collectors in Galilee. Jesus has table fellowship with tax collectors and sinners. And this is a type or a role of gaining money or revenue that is really implemented by the Ptolemies, and subsequently in further generations is a model that is kept. So war breaks out between the Seleucids, so this is the ones who control places like Syria and Babylon, and the Ptolemies, who controlled Egypt, between 274 and 253 BC for control of Palestine and the coast, because the coasts are what's primary for trade. And in particular, the jewel of the crown would have been Tyre, because Tyre was a shipbuilding city. And so gaining control of the coast helps to gain control of shipbuilding, which is important for trade throughout the Mediterranean. Now, peace, or a kind of a peace, is reached when Ptolemy II gives his daughter Bernice to marriage to Antioch II. Now, Antioch II was already married to a woman by the name of Laodice, and already had a son, Seleucus III. But in order to maintain this peace, he kind of divorces Laodice and sends his son away. So this is a pretty major thing to be happening, and Laodice is not going to, take this, sitting down. Now, this is actually these details that I'm giving you here are actually part of the background for a very careful reading of the book of Daniel. So if somebody's reading Daniel chapter 10, chapter 11 in particular, the history that is being kind of recorded in the form of a vision or a dream is reflecting on some of the events that I'm describing here between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. The high priest, a fellow by the name of Onias II, and he's the chief tax collector, is going to revolt against Egypt. But the Ptolemies allows him to stay high priest, but they're going to make Joseph, the Tobiat, the tax collector and the chief civic leader. So usually it's the high priest who is the chief civic leader in Jerusalem. But because he rebelled against the Ptolemies, he no longer was going to have that type of authority, although he was able to keep his position as high priest. So the Oniats and the Tobiats, these two families are going to play a very important role here in terms of political control in Jerusalem. So in 2004 BCE, Ptolemy V, at the age of 5, is going to take over Egypt after his father dies. And by 200 BCE, so just about 4 years later, Antiochus III is going to take Palestine into his kingdom. So you have a young boy who's going to become king. So he's usually the head of the military. He's the military, he's the person who holds it all together. So Antiochus III sees this as an opportunity to gain the very valuable land of Palestine, and particularly its coastline, and including as well Tyre. So under the Seleucus, we're going to see as well a number of very significant advances for Jews that are going to impact the Jesus movement and the rise of early Christianity. So the Seleucus were much more interested in the promotion of Hellenism, whereas the Ptolemies recognized these different people, had their own religions and their own gods, and pretty much left them to themselves. You go ahead and do your own thing, but as long as you keep paying us the taxes. But the Seleucids were interested in more that the people that they ruled over were adopting more Hellenistic culture. And so this is going to make a major conflict for the Jews living in Judea. So a major way in which Hellenism was disseminated was through the polis, that is, the Greek cities, so many of which were built in and around Palestine. So a lot of times people are familiar in the Gospel of Mark with Jesus at one time going into what's called the Decapolis. So this Decapolis, the word Deca referring to 10, polis city, so 10 cities. So if you have Greeks who are moving into these areas that are administered by Greeks, they also want to move into areas that reflect Greek culture because that's where they're coming from. That is the marker of sophistication, civilization. So cities were built in order to attract Greeks to come and live. And so some of these were being built, near Galilee in the area known as the Decapolis. But only Greeks could obtain citizenship in Greek cities. So if you're a Jew or a non-Greek living in this area, you might be able to take advantage of the civilization or of the improvements of these cities and the advantages that were given to these cities, but you couldn't be a citizen of the city. So citizens had access to public funds and tax benefits. So there's an attraction that people have towards wanting to be a citizen of a Greek city. So gymnasiums is where athletes were competing to honor the Greek gods. It's also areas where education took place. It's a way in which Hellenism disseminates its values and its culture. The Seleucids made the high priest, now who was Simon II, and who was an Oniot, the chief civil authority again. So remember that previously chief priests had lost the ability to be the civic authority, but now the Seleucids were making them that authority again. But there are many Tobiats, this other family that lives in Jerusalem, and they were able to get positions of power in Jerusalem. So in Jerusalem, we have these two huge families that are basically kind of at war or at odds with each other for dominance, power, and for influence. So what we really have here is a crisis that's occurring for Jews under Hellenism. Really, Hellenism is this cultural change. I have a quote here from a former professor of mine who talked about it as a cultural change. So, in other words, it's the total way of thinking, lifestyles, which a group of people seeks to pass on from one generation to another generation. So, really, what's happening here with Hellenism is this way of thinking, this lifestyle, which people are trying to pass from one group to another. The distinction between Hellenism, this Greek influence, and Judaism was really first introduced by the author of Second Maccabees. This is a Jewish work to tell a story about a family who were involved in the uprising against a Seleucid ruler. And so this author, writing in Greek about Jews, he makes this distinction, really the first one that we have in literature, between Hellenism and Judaism, as if they are two different things. So there are three distinctive features of Hellenistic culture. There's government, its daily life or its concept of citizenship, and its Greek spirit. So I'll just briefly talk about these three. So in Hellenistic government, areas are divided into city-states. So the city is always the most important thing. They don't spend so much time thinking about villages. And it's from the cities that every regions or areas are maintained or controlled. And, based upon the works of other philosophers, you really thought about living in a city is where civilization really occurs. The civilized people live in cities. So usually cities have something like a king with absolute power, although, in Hellenistic, we might think of Athens as being a democracy. Kings, it's Alexander the Great was a Macedonian and was king of the Macedonians, and Ptolemies and the Seleucids were, in essence, kings of their areas. These city-states operate off of kind of like a monarchy, but they have power in these cities, but of course it's not really absolute in the sense that they must always serve the emperor or the ruler in which they live in. So cities also have a council, what's called a boule, that's made up of either all citizens or elective representatives. So that's interesting that you can have people who are elected to be in the boule, in the council, on top of those who are citizens. The cities of Palestine in the first century were just a few. So Jerusalem is a city, and so you have to have a council. You have to have a ruler. Now you have a high priest who can rule. Later on, that's going to change, but you have a high priest. You have Caesarea. Now, all this is going to come up later in the Roman period. So this is not during the time of the Seleucid control, but later when we get in the period of the Romans. You have Sepphoris, so it's from somewhere between 2,000 to 30,000 people. You have Tiberias, again a Roman city, 12,000 to 40,000, and you have Magdala, less than 44,000. So at the time of Jesus, the cities of Palestine, are these. So, and interestingly, you don't have Jesus going to Caesarea. You don't have him going to Sepphoris. You don't have him going to Tiberias. I don't think there's anything where he goes to Magdala, though you have Mary Magdalene, who comes from Magdala. So one might begin to imagine how he comes in contact with her, but there's no record of him going into these cities. Jesus primarily focuses in on villages of Galilee before he will head towards the city of Jerusalem. So, gospel authors, interestingly, will often label villages as cities, even though technically they would not be called a city. But calling a village a city is a way of giving honor to that village or recognizing the significance of that village, even though it doesn't really classify as a city. So when it comes to citizenship, well, citizenship is really granted in kind of with an urban dimension. So in other words, people who live in the rural countryside are not really citizens. It's people who belong to a city. Native Greeks and upper class foreigners could hold citizenship. The marketplace, the agora, was the center of the political, religious, and commercial activities. The gymnasium was the center of education and exercise. Of course, this issue of exercise is interesting because Jews in particular don't have really a history of exercises. Exercise is not a thing that they do, or at least we don't really have literature of them. But as Greeks are coming in, and as some Jews are wanting to adopt Greek culture, then some boys are going to participate in Greek exercise activity. Rhetoric, though, was at the center of education. So it was very important that a young man knows how to speak, that they know how to articulate, that they know how to argue, that they know how to be persuasive. So rhetoric was a crucial area of education, and we actually have handbooks that were written long ago, ancient times, about how to train a young Greek boy in the areas of rhetoric. Now, when it comes to the Greek spirit, the primary virtues of Greek spirit is that of harmony, living at peace, wisdom, acquiring that it is, how to navigate in life well, courage, temperance, that you have balance in the things that you do, so you don't engage in excesses, endurance, and justice. Life is dominated for a lot of Greeks by the concept of fate. So, in other words, that there are some things that are planned. The life of the gods, the life of individuals like kings are planned. Other human beings' life might be planned by the gods. And the meaning of life then is to avoid pain and unhappiness. So certain philosophies pick up particularly this idea of avoiding pain, avoiding unhappiness, how to make one's ethical decisions so that one does not have to suffer pain. Epicurean philosophy, in particular, stressed freedom and pleasure, but it's very important not to confuse Epicurean philosophy with hedonism. And hedonism, that's where you throw caution to the wind and you just live for today and you get as much pleasure as you possibly can. You don't think about tomorrow. But Epicureans know that you have to face tomorrow. And if you have excesses behavior today, you may have consequences for that tomorrow. So you want to practice temperance. But freedom is an important concept. Freedom is an important concept in all Greek philosophies. How does one really demonstrate that they are free? You do not want to be a slave. A slave is like a subhuman. It's the lowest position that a person can be. So the ideal of human existence is to experience freedom. Now, Stoicism, another very popular philosophy of the time, is also living in harmony with order. So, in other words, they thought that the world was constructed according to an order, and this order was planned or set in motion by the Logos. The Logos is a being or spirit who can set the world in its order. And for Stoics, you want to recognize what that order is, and you want to accept that order, and you want to live in harmony with it. Now, so if you try to resist that order, if you try to do something against what is orderly, then you are going to have an unhappy life. You are not going to prosper. You're going to have suffering. So, for Stoics, then, is to discover what it is that the Logos wants in terms of order and to live accordingly. And so there's a bit of a predestination idea here as well, that certain people are, determined by the Logos to live a certain way, to live in a certain class, as it were, to be a certain kind of person, slave or free, and one accepts that order and lives accordingly. Mystery religions were also becoming popular, in that where there were these secrets that were shared with initiates. In other words, you had to become a member of the group to know these secrets about the world and about the gods. And in particular, the mystery religions offered something which Epicureans and Stoicism and pagan religions couldn't, and that is a relationship with not only other humans, but also with the gods. So now with other people, you can have this bond, even though you're not related to them. You can have a bond with human beings, belonging, as it were, to a group of people who have acquired a special knowledge about the God, and this God has a special relationship with those people who have that knowledge. So cultivation of the mind and the body was a part of the culture and religious ceremonies. So you see lots of things where it is a celebration of not only the body, such as the Olympic Games, but also it is the cultivation of the mind, what one can speculate, can decide, can learn, can discover. So the Greek spirit was quite a radical transformation, and as Hellenism is going to spread. So I'll make this my first video. It's enough to deal with this, and I'll pick up a little bit more about the Hellenism and its relationship to Semitic culture in the next video.